They were never supposed to hear this. Not you, not me, not anyone outside that room. Because the moment this recording escaped, it didn't just reveal a secret, it exposed fear, power, and the quiet rules that decide what the world is allowed to know. The interview lasted 43 minutes. Only 6 minutes ever surfaced. And those 6 minutes were enough to make people panic. It started as a routine conversation.com setting. 2 chairs, a microphone, and a promise that nothing would go public without approval. That promise was broken. Not by accident, by necessity. Because sometimes information refuses to stay buried. The person being interviewed wasn't a celebrity, not a politician, not a household name. And that's why it worked. They were an insider without the spotlight. Someone with access, not attention. Someone who had seen things long before the public was supposed to. At first, the questions were harmless. Background, career, small talk. The kind of setup that makes you relax and forget the microphone is even there. Then the tone changed. A pause. A breath held too long. And a question that wasn't on the approved list. It was subtly almost polite. But it landed like a crack in glass. The interviewee hesitated. You can hear it in the recording. That half second where the mind calculates risk. That's when the truth almost stayed hidden. But instead they answered, not fully, not recklessly, just enough to change everything. They spoke about a decision made years earlier, one that affected millions, one that was officially described as necessary. But according to them, it wasn't. It was convenient. They explained how warnings were dismissed, how concerns were how reports were edited until the danger looked manageable. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't accuse. They simply described what happened, and that calmness made it worse. Because panic sounds different when it's whispered. Then came the sentence that sealed the interview's fate. A sentence so simple it almost sounded harmless. If people had known back then, they would never have agreed. That's when the room shifted. You can't see it, but you can feel it. The interviewer tried to steer away, tried to soften the moment. But it was too late. The door was open, and the interviewee walked through it. They spoke about internal meetings that never made it into public records. About alternatives ignored because they were inconvenient. About timelines adjusted to fit a story, not reality. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated. Just facts spoken too plainly. And that was the problem, because the truth doesn't need decoration to be dangerous. At minute 21, the interviewer stopped taking notes. At minute 27, the producer shifted in their seat. At minute 31, someone outside the room knocked. That knock never appears in the released audio, but it happened. The interview ended early. No closing remarks. No final question. Just silence. Within hours, the recording was flagged. Within days, it was locked. Within weeks, it officially never happened. Emails went out reminding everyone about confidentiality. Contracts were referenced, consequences implied, not stated. The interviewer was told the footage was unusable. The producer was reassigned. The interviewee stopped responding to messages altogether, and that should have been the end. But stories like this don't end cleanly, because someone made a copy. No one knows who. An assistant, a technician, someone who understood the weight of what they were hearing. The copy sat untouched for months. Then something happened. A related event hit the news. Confusion, anger, questions that felt familiar. And suddenly, the recording mattered again. 6 minutes were extracted carefully, deliberately. Enough to reveal the core truth. Not enough to expose identities. When those 6 minutes leaked, reactions were immediate. The clip spread faster than anyone expected. People didn't argue at first. They listened, then they replayed it. Then they noticed the gaps. Why does it cut here? Why does the audio fade there? Why does it end so abruptly? The absence became louder than the sound. Official responses followed quickly. Statements calling the clip misleading, demands for context that was never provided. Claims that the full interview would only confuse people. But people aren't afraid of confusion. They're afraid of being managed. The interviewer broke their silence with one sentence online. I asked the question because I was told not to. It was deleted within hours, but screenshots, don't forget. The interviewee never spoke publicly again. No interviews, no statements, No explanations. They didn't disappear. Tay Whitray friends said they became cautious, careful with words, careful with trust. Because once you say something you weren't meant to say, you learn how fragile permission really is. Behind the scenes, damage control intensified. Search results shifted. Articles Bani said keywords stopped working the way they used to. The clip became harder to find, then nearly impossible. But by then, it didn't matter, because the idea was already loose, and ideas done to obey orders. People began connecting dots. Old reports, timelines re-examined. The interview wasn't proof. It was permission. Permission to question what had always been presented as settled. That's why it was never meant to air. Not because it was false, but because it was calm. And calm truth is harder to dismiss than loud accusations. Years later, a journalist tried to locate the full recording. They contacted everyone involved. Most didn't respond. One replied with a warning. "Stop looking. Not it doesn't exist. Not you're wrong. Just stop." The journalist didn't. They traced backups, storage logs, archive drives. The trail ended where it shouldn't have. A server scheduled for deletion, wiped clean months after the interview. Officially, routine maintenance. Unofficially, no one could explain why that specific file was targeted, why its deletion was prioritized, why a conversation that never mattered required so much effort to erase. The 6 minutes still exist, floating, shared quietly, passed between people who know how to listen. They aren't explosive. They don't shout. They simply sit there asking one question over and over again. If this part wasn't supposed to be heard, what else wasn't? That's the danger of a buried interview. Not what it says, but what it makes people wonder. Because when something is pulled before the public can react, it tells you one thing very clearly. The reaction mattered, and the truth was never the problem.